Okay, I think we can kick off. So good afternoon, everyone. I'm Alan Barrett, the Director of the Economic and Social Research Institute, and it's a great pleasure for me to welcome everybody today to this webinar where we'll be launching a new report titled Origin and Integration, Housing and Family Among Migrants in Ireland. So we're going to be with you for about the next hour and 15 minutes, and the plan of action will be in a couple of moments. We'll have some introductory remarks from Minister O'Gorman. Then my colleague, Fran McGinnity, will take you through the details of the report. As we often try and do now on launches of this type, we always try and balance the sort of more academic research-oriented contribution from the ESRI speakers. We balance that with some policy responses, and really delighted today that we'll have Carol Baxter from the department and Downey from Dublin City Council who'll give us policy oriented perspectives on this issue. And then hopefully, if everybody stays to time, which I'm sure they will, we'll have about 15 to 20 minutes for some Q&A at the end of the event where we'll explore the issues in greater detail. So I should say at the outset, it's a great pleasure, obviously, for the Institute to be working in this area. I don't have to tell this audience what an important area this is. I suppose it's, ironically, in a way, the department had been thinking about this area, for quite a while, and as a result had asked the Institute to work on this. But obviously, the entire issue of housing and immigrants has just become, much more focused issue. So hopefully, this work can feed into the very, very difficult and important decisions and sort of processes that have to be dealt with in the coming weeks and months. So I'm going to hand over straight away then to Minister O'Gorman. As you all know, Roderic O'Gorman's Minister for Children, Equality, Disability, Integration and Youth. We've been working with the department in a collaborative way for quite a long time now. It's always a great pleasure to be able to welcome the Minister along. So with that, Minister O'Gorman, I'll hand over to you.
Good afternoon, Alan. Thanks very much for your introduction there. And look, I'm very pleased to be here with you today to launch this study on housing and family among migrants. And as you alluded to, this is the 9th report that has been published under the Equality and Integration Research Programme that's undertaken between my department and the ESRI. And I'd like to thank all the authors, they being Frances McGinnity, Sarah Kirsten, James Lawrence, Ivan Privlaco, Helen Russell and Amy Stapleton for this really important contribution to what we know about outcomes for migrants here in Ireland. Integration research is important in helping us to design the right evidence-based responses to the needs of those who choose to make Ireland their home, whether for the short term or for the longer term. And government policy on integration sets the goal of a society in which all migrants and their Irish-born children are enabled and encouraged to participate fully in all aspects of life in Ireland. And in designing the policies that will help us achieve this goal, it is essential that we have access to detailed evidence on current integration outcomes. And this study that we're launching today provides insights into the housing and family situation of migrants to Ireland. Housing is an important indicator of integration, and it can tell us much about the economic and social inclusion of different migrant groups. An integrated society is built on communities that are integrated, and previous research under this programme has found that migrants to Ireland are well integrated geographically. That is, that they are living throughout Ireland in cities, in towns, and somewhat less so, but also present in rural areas. Overall, we've not seen the growth of heavily concentrated migrant populations of the type of pattern that can prove challenging to integration. And this study takes a closer look at the housing situation of migrants. And as such, it gives us more detailed insights into housing tenure, housing type, overcrowding, and other measures of housing integration. And a key message from the data is that migrants are far more likely than Irish-born residents to be living in private rented accommodation. And this has important implications for both housing, but also for integration policy as well. And essentially, it's telling us that there is an overlap between housing and integration policy that we need to pay close attention to. And in particular, when we think about the private rental sector, we need to recognise that any pressure in this sector, and equally our policy responses to them, will have a disproportionate impact on migrants and hence on their integration. The study also looks at the family situation of migrants, and this too is very valuable policy evidence. family composition can influence integration outcomes. For example, it can affect access to the labour market, which is a key measure of integration. And this research illuminates differences in the family situation of migrants compared to Irish-born families, and thus can help us to develop effective policies to support integration, both of migrants and their Irish-born children. And look, integration is a broad concept, and it requires a broad policy response. And it takes efforts that are both coordinated and collaborative from both central and local government and delivery agencies working in partnership with non-governmental actors. And some migrants need targeted supports to enable them integrate successfully, and many others do not. But even where mainstream services are sufficient to meet the needs of migrant populations, it is incumbent on service providers to ensure that this is the case, to pay attention to impacts of their services on minority groups, and to take steps to address any inequalities of experience, opportunity, or outcome that tend to emerge. And in recent years, the Migrant Integration Strategy has been, I suppose, the focus of the whole of government framework for these efforts across government and state agencies. My department will shortly commence the development of a successor to the Migrant Integration Strategy, and today's report by the ESRI will prove to be a useful guide to that process, and it will help to inform the types of objectives which we might set in relation to housing and family, and the actions and commitments that would flow from these. It will also help to inform the National Action Plan Against Racism, development of which is well advanced under the stewardship of an independent committee led by Professor Caroline Fennell. And while the evidence and data of this report long predated the Russian invasion of Ukraine on the 24th of February, I couldn't complete my remarks today without making a reference to that and the refugee crisis that continues to unfold as a result of it. And from the very earliest days of that crisis, when it became apparent that large numbers of people had no choice but to flee, Ireland has taken a very clear position that we will welcome anyone who needed refuge and do our very best to support them in their time of crisis. And I'm proud of the approach that we've taken, and I'm also proud of the huge and generous response that we've seen from all sectors of Irish society. And my department is working with colleagues across government in the departments of justice, social protection, education, health, and others to provide essential supports, including accommodation, to those fleeing this war. And while the numbers are growing daily, and we know that over 21,000 people have now sought refuge here from Ukraine. And look, this is an unprecedented scale in the context of Ireland's experience of providing international protection. And my department and others were working intensively to provide safety, a home, education for children, opportunities to work, and a chance to try and resume normal life in as much as that's possible. And evidence shows that early integration has been very beneficial for refugees and asylum seekers. So it is important that we do our best to enable those who fled here from Ukraine to rebuild as normal a life as possible, as soon as that's possible. And it is likely in time that many will return to their home in Ukraine, but others may stay here in Ireland and build their homes and family life here. And hence we will need to develop longer term policy responses, as well as meeting the immediate humanitarian needs now. And that whole idea of early integration and integration from day one of protection applicants, that's at the very heart of the new policy for asylum seekers that I've set out in the white paper to end direct provision and to establish a new international protection support service. And I published this last year, and it's now being implemented on a phased basis. And Carol Baxter, who'll be speaking later on, was a driving force behind both the drafting and the implementation of the white paper. And under the new system set out in the white paper, international protection applicants will no longer spend periods living in congregated settings. Instead, following an initial 4-month stay in a reception and integration centre, they will move to independent accommodation in houses and apartments in towns and cities across the country. And this represents a major change. My department is taking the necessary steps to put this new accommodation model in place. And while our response to the Ukraine crisis is understandably impacting on our efforts in this space, We're also confident that we are learning from the rapid large-scale mobilisation of accommodation and other supports in a way that will help us to implement the white paper reforms. My department is also currently developing the integration programme required to support the principle of integration from day one as set out in the white paper. And in collaboration with the local authorities, we are designing the supports that will be needed at a local level and the structures required to coordinate and deliver them. This will expand the current model of interagency working groups and resettlement and intercultural workers that is in place for the Irish Refugee Protection Programme, which was established in 2015 to support refugees from the war in Syria. And our aim is to establish a permanent integration system based at the local level, which will provide support to all migrants, irrespective of the routes or the channels through which they accessed our country. So whatever the context in which people arrive here, whether it is in flight from war or persecution, as economic migrants, as international students, for family reunification, or for other reasons, it is essential that the policy framework we have to support their integration is well informed by objective evidence and independent research. And this is exactly the sort of independent research that we're launching today. So I believe this study will make a really valuable contribution to our understanding of the housing needs, to our understanding of the family structures, and thus to our understanding of the integration supports necessary to continue to provide for all people living in our country. So I want to thank the ESRI, thank again the authors for all their work in bringing forward this important publication, and I've no doubt it will be a significant part of the ongoing research in this area. Thanks very much, Alan.
Thanks so much, as ever, Minister. I know you've busy times, to put it mildly, so we release you at this stage. But just to say, wish you all sort of the best of luck with the demands that are on you at the moment. I mean, obviously, I think I said before, you have an enormously important job, and I think collectively the nation understands that your own efforts to try and welcome and facilitate Ukrainian refugees, there couldn't be a more important task really at the moment. So let us wish you all the best with that. And also, as ever, to sort of say, if the ESRI can be of any assistance or anything like that as a backup, we're always very, very happy to do that. But anyway, continue good wishes to you and your colleagues, Minister. And thanks yet again for launching today's report. Okay, so with that then, it's a great pleasure for me to hand over to my colleague, Fran McGinnity. So Fran is going to take you through the details of the report, and then, as I said earlier, we'll have some responses later on. But over to you, Fran, and I presume you'll be sharing a screen.
Yes, thanks, Alan, and welcome to everybody. My name is Fran McGinnity. I'm lead author on this report on housing and family among migrants in Ireland, and I'm presenting some key findings from the report on behalf of my co-authors. I'll just share my screen now. So I coordinate a programme of research on integration and equality housed in the ESRI and now funded by the Department of Children, Equality, Disability, Integration and Youth. And I'd like to acknowledge the department's funding and commitment to this research programme. As the Minister said, this is the 9th report in the research programme. And as a researcher, it's great to see a body of research build up. It's particularly exciting as a researcher to have access to census microdata to investigate migrant integration, as we can do things and distinguish groups that simply aren't possible with other data sources. So we'd like to thank the CSO statisticians who facilitated access to the data, and thanks of course to the Minister for taking time out of his busy schedule to join us. I'll go quite fast through the key findings in this presentation, but there'll be time for questions at the end. So a key question in this research programme is how migrants are getting on, how they're integrating into Irish society. Other research in the programme has looked at their labour market outcomes, the jobs they have, residential segregation. This report is a deep dive into their housing and family situation. To the extent that integration means finding a place in your new society, housing is a key component. Adequate housing provides safety and shelter at its most basic. It allows people to work, participate in education, and to integrate and feel belonging in communities. Migrants, like other individuals, are embedded in families, and the structure and nature of these families have implications for the integration of migrants, first-generation migrants, and their children. So we use Census 2016 microdata comparing housing and family outcomes for people born in Ireland with that of first-generation migrants, examining what this means for their integration. Similar to much integration research, we compare the housing and family situation of migrant groups, that's those born abroad, to that of Irish born. This is a typical benchmark, a way of saying how high is high. But it's useful to remember that home ownership, for example, is very high in Ireland and overcrowding is low by international standards. So it matters what kind of society migrants are integrating into. We use information on all those usually resident in Ireland in April 2016, so great potential to distinguish more migrant groups than before. You know, rather than just talking about non-EU migrants, we can distinguish those born in South Asia or Central and South America, Middle East and North Africa, other parts of Africa. So in this sense, this report complements the monitoring report on integration series by presenting a much more detailed information on housing and family groups for a much larger proportion of, for a much broader range of groups then. Just looking briefly at the outcomes we focus on in the report: housing tenure, that's whether people are living in owner-occupied accommodation or renting either privately or from a local authority. Overcrowding, if they're living in housing with more than one person per room. Homelessness, this is based on published statistics from the census, as we didn't have access to the microdata, but an important indicator of access to housing. These are the two I'll focus on in the presentation. In terms of then family situation, we look at housing composition and focusing particularly on lone parent families. The report also considers the number of children and how that compares between migrant groups and Irish born. And we also look at mixed unions, that's migrant Irish born partnerships. Again, we'll detailed charts on both household composition and mixed unions will be shown in the presentation, but a number of children we can discuss a little bit afterwards. So this is just a very brief context, a background: immigration to Ireland between 2000 and 2019. Marked here is 2016, of course, when the census, the last census was fielded, and here you see a rapid increase in immigration towards the end of the economic boom, and also that most people who came were EU migrants. By 2016, 17% of the population resident in Ireland were born abroad. And of course, the census measures who was there at the time, not the flows, but the stocks. So what sort of a place are migrants coming into? Ireland is a country dominated by home ownership. This chart shows households by tenure in Ireland from 1960 to 2016. Here you see that home ownership here, owner-occupied accommodation rose throughout the 80s and 90s, before then falling again. Local authority provision fell quite dramatically during these boom years, and overall provision is much lower than it had been, particularly in the 1960s and early 70s. In combination with that, then partly as a result, of course, the proportion of households renting privately has gone up quite rapidly in the last number of years. So there's a much greater proportion of households now in the private rented sector with problems of supply, as many of you will know, in this sector. That's just to give a bit of background to know where the housing situation that migrants were coming into. As I said before, we use detailed census microdata. We count all those usually resident in Ireland on the night of the 24th of April, no tourists or visitors. The coverage is full population. That includes communal accommodation. The census also enumerates homeless individuals. We look at individuals for housing analysis. But the best information is for families is from the head of household. So the family analysis is at head of household level. Migrant counts all those born outside the Republic of Ireland. We can discuss this a little later. That's just first generation migrants. And then we use models to explore to what extent differences are linked that we observe in sort of housing and family outcomes are linked to various other factors. So I presume many in the audience, at least certainly those tuning in from Ireland, might remember filling out the census form just over a week ago. So now here's what you see, the kind of things that can be done with the census. So these are the migrant groups we look at. As I said, we can distinguish a lot more because we have 750,000 individuals born abroad. So here in this top row, we have migrants from the EU or the UK. We distinguish UK nationals. They were part of the EU then, but they've always been separately distinguished in integration research. Poland, because those born in Poland make up such a great proportion of this group, then EU West and EU East other. And then we have all of the non-EU groups. So other Europe is from non-EU Europe. So that would count Ukrainians who were living in Ireland in 2016 would fall in here. Then we've got North Americans, Australians, New Zealand and Canada. We also distinguish Central and South Americans, Africans, excluding the North Africans. They're in another group. So this is Sub-Saharan, East and South, Southern Africa. Then we've got the Middle East and North African group, the South Asians and East Asians. I can answer detailed questions about who's in what group at the end, and I'm happy to go into the detail there. I suppose one thing to bear in mind is that EU migrants can come to live and work in Ireland without restriction, as can UK nationals. For non-EU UK, they're subject to managed migration policy and they require a residence permission. They come to study, work in highly skilled jobs, or others come seeking international protection or as refugees. Of course, these groups vary in size. Here's just a quick overview of the size of migrant groups. So almost 83% then born in Ireland. And then these are the slightly darker blue shading is those born in EU countries. So that's 12% of the total, and then smaller proportions of the overall population born in some of those other groups. So what about their housing situation? This chart presents housing tenure by country of birth groups for individuals living in Ireland in 2016. The blue refers to home ownership, red is private rental, green is local authority approved housing bodies. So this is the answer to the question, does your household own or rent your accommodation? What's immediately obvious from this chart is that most Irish live in owner-occupied accommodation. 77% of Irish live in owner-occupied accommodation, 13% rent privately. Whereas for migrants, those born elsewhere, 33% live in owner-occupied accommodation and 56% rent privately. 10% of each renting from the local authority. Now, the situation does vary for different migrant groups. You see the UK, including Northern Ireland and North Americans, they are much more likely to live in owner-occupied accommodation, but other groups, for example, Polish and other Eastern Europe, East EU, they're much more likely to be renting. 3/4 of Polish migrants are renting. But now you're probably thinking to yourself, well, aren't they all younger? Aren't there other factors that are influencing them living in private rented accommodation? And yes, many migrant groups are young adults, and this is related to this is part of the explanation why they're more likely to be private rented. They're less likely to live in rural areas. They're those who are not employed are less are more likely to be renting, though for many of these migrant groups, I have to say employment rates are quite high. In general, it's the recent arrivals, those with poor language skills, no Irish partner. This is, you know, having lived in Ireland longer, definitely associated with more home ownership. But even those who came in the early 2000s, that big peak of migration, almost 44% are still renting. Polish nationals are Polish born are 20 times as likely to be private renting as Irish nationals after controls. So, I mean, we know that private renting quality varies, but also that it's associated with less security and stability. This constant moving or not knowing when you'll need to move may mean people don't settle or put down roots and integrate into communities. There's also greater affordability problems in this sector right now. Turning now to overcrowding as a measure of habitability, as it's known. Overcrowding in the census is based on the number of people in the household and the number of rooms. So overcrowded is counted as having more than one person per room, not counting bathrooms and sort of halls and landings, etc. Overcrowding is low in Ireland by international standards, but migrants are more likely to be living in overcrowded accommodation. That's 8% of Irish born, but 20% around 20% of migrants. Again, not the UK, those from Western Europe or North America, but we see some of these non-EU groups, Middle East and North Africa, Sub-Saharan and other African, South Asian and East Asian, up to almost 40%. That's 2 in 5. Factors linked to overcrowding, well, yes, country of origin, not being employed or being in low-skilled employment, ethnicity. Overcrowding is particularly high among Irish travellers, but also those of Black and Asian ethnicity. Family structure, you know, it's married, cohabiting couples with children in particular, and also rented accommodation, either private or local authority renting. So accounting for these factors much reduces the Irish migrant difference. But still, we do find many of the groups are somewhat more likely to end up in more overcrowded accommodation. Turning now to some of the family indicators. This is migrant head of household, age 20 to 54. This shows the makeup of the different households, whether it's a one-person household, that's here in the navy blue. Couples with no children are in red. Couples with children are in the yellow here, and as you can see, that's that's most of these households. Lone parents are in green. Other more complex families are in this sort of reddy brown, maroon, I guess, and these unrelated, unrelated adults, that's a group of people who aren't related in a house share. Here we can see again that there's quite a bit of variation. We've got Irish born down here and in Poland, you know, there's certain groups like the West Europeans and the Central and South Americans who are much more likely to be living as living alone or in couples without children. For the modelling, then we focus on there's obviously a lot of different constellations here and family constellations. We focus in on the lone parent households, as previous research in Ireland from ESRI colleagues show how lone parent households are at much greater risk of poverty, negatively affecting both the parents and child outcomes. So in terms of if we think of factors linked to lone parenthood, generally most migrant households are less likely to be in lone parent households than Irish born. That's the main message from this analysis. The two exceptions are heads of household born in the UK and in sub-Saharan African. These groups are more likely to be lone parents. I should say we only observe those living in the household, of course, and parents and children may be living abroad, particularly for migrant head of households. But for this kind of information, we need a dedicated survey of migrants. I'm sure you were thinking there was probably enough information collected in the census. There's obviously limits there in a whole population census about how much information can be collected. Finally, I'm just going to turn now to mixed unions, intermarriage or mixed partnerships. This is sometimes called, again, the focus is on household heads aged 20 to 54, and here some clear patterns emerge. The blue bars are where both partners are born abroad. Red is one partner born in Ireland, one migrant partner. That's these mixed unions. And then, of course, there are a proportion of these household heads, a portion of these groups that where there's no partner. But what really stands out from the analysis of mixed unions is that for North Americans and UK born, 70% of those who are in partnerships, if we just take those who are in partnerships, a very high proportion are with Irish born. But for other groups like Polish or South Asians, only 3 or 4% of the partnerships were with Irish born. You know, quite a large proportion of these groups are in partnerships, but they're not with Irish born. We don't know when the partnership was formed, but we do know that having an Irish partner is associated with lower rates of private renting, higher home ownership. Migrants with an Irish partner are only half as likely as other migrants to live in overcrowded accommodation. And we know from research using Growing Up in Ireland that having a migrant partner is, having an Irish parent is beneficial for children's linguistic outcomes. Turning now to some policy implications, it is true that across the Western world, migrants tend to rent and rent privately. In Ireland, it's just there's challenges in the private rented sector, and these challenges disproportionately affect migrants. Ireland is predominantly a home owning society, and there are some substantial challenges in the private rented sector. So addressing some of these challenges, protection from rising rent, ensuring adequate standards is very important. As the Minister mentioned, you know, making housing a priority in the next Migrant Integration Strategy is an urgent action. For disadvantaged low-income migrants and in fact other disadvantaged groups, increasing the provision of local authority housing. So these groups aren't competing for private rented property and having to source the property themselves, which can cause them difficulties. Happy to talk about this a little more. And then, of course, for migrants who can afford it, reduce some of the barriers to accessing mortgage credit, the high demands on a credit and employment history, and maybe some more information about how how to purchase accommodation. Yes, that's just some limitations, and just a reminder then that the census doesn't collect detailed information on income. We have their the kind of job people are in and their educational backgrounds, which we use, and we only observe people in the household in April 2016. And a final important point is that we can't identify refugees and those who have been through the protection system in the census. And this is important, and particularly in the current context, it's important that the outcomes of people who come here seeking refuge and protection, that what happens then later on in their integration journey is very important. There's a few key messages about the challenges that migrants face in the housing market, that they're concentrated in private rented sector, higher risk of overcrowding, and the non-Irish nationals are more at risk of homelessness. Thank you very much for listening. Comments would be very welcome. I've just posted the link to the report there if you want to read more, but do feel free to ask in the Q&A. There's also a link to the research programme. As I said, this is the 9th in a whole series of publications, so if you want to read more there, it's here. And just as a little coming soon, we'll soon be publishing a report on wages and working conditions of non-Irish nationals. So if you're interested in that, keep an eye out. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thanks so much, Fran. Made your way through a lot of material there, so congratulations for doing so. And actually, as Fran mentioned, if people want to start entering questions into the Q&A function, that would be great. I'll try and relay them then in a couple of minutes. I think some people are also chatting in the chat function, which is great. But if you could put the questions into the Q&A function, it's just then I know where they are and what's a question versus what's just a comment. Comments are very welcome as well, but you get the general idea. The other thing actually that Fran mentioned there, when she talked about the website of the programme, again, as a lot of you will know, this is an ongoing research program where the research builds up. And I always sort of have this feeling that the individual reports are important, but it's actually the accumulation of knowledge that becomes particularly important. And what's great about a research program of this nature is we're now seeing this body of information building up, which is tremendously useful. Okay, with that, it's a great pleasure for me to welcome Carol Baxter from the department to say a few words. Carol, of course, an old friend of the ESRI. It's great that you're here, Carol, because you've been a great supporter and sponsor of the research program over the last number of years, and has had a friend at the Institute before that. So we're delighted to have you. We look forward to your comments.
Thanks very much, Alan. Thanks very, very much for the invitation. Very pleased to have the opportunity to provide the policy response to this important piece of integration research. This research, as Fran McGinnity has said, is the most recent output from the department's multi-annual equality and integration research programme with the Institute. And the programme has produced numerous studies since its inception in 2017. It has become a key means by which high quality policy evidence on integration outcomes, barriers and possible solutions is made available to policymakers and practitioners. This research is obviously of great interest to our department, which is lead policy responsibility for migrant integration. But as we know, integration is a very broad concept. It really touches on all areas of public policy. Wherever public services are provided, some of the service users are likely to be migrants. Equally, migrants and migrant-led families are participants in the economic and social life of our nation. They engage in the same labour market, the same housing market as their Irish-born counterparts. And so integration research is also essential to inform policy in these areas, as well as education, health, social and community supports, and so on. I noticed that Sinead Gibney is here today, and she reminds me that all public service providers have an obligation under the public sector, a human rights and equality duty to protect human rights, promote equality and combat discrimination in the course of their work. Sometimes the public sector duty may seem somewhat divorced from reality, but in fact, it is crucial it shows the key impact of differential provision of public services on the outcome for migrants and non-migrants alike. So the most salient finding in today's study is the greatly increased likelihood of living in private rental accommodation if you're a migrant compared to if you're Irish born. In one sense, it's not surprising because, for instance, more recently arrived migrants are those who have come to live here only temporarily. Private rental accommodation may well be best placed to provide them with the choices and flexibility that they seek with respect to location, budget, accommodation type, and so on. It's of course important that as private tenants, they're entering a market that's adequately regulated and that they do not experience discrimination. And indeed, the equality legislation has most recently a new protected ground which prohibits discrimination on the basis of access to the housing assistance payment. But the decision to rent in and of itself is not necessarily evidence of an integration barrier. As you know, and this has been referenced by Professor McGinnity, Ireland has unusually high rates of home ownership by international standards, and many migrants would not, at least initially, consider it a priority to own property in the way that their Irish-born counterparts might. However, what is perhaps of more concern to an integration policymaker is that even if migrants who have lived in Ireland for long periods of time are still far more likely to be in rental accommodation than Irish-born, we need to pay attention to this, to question it, and to respond if necessary. Is it evidence that migrants are getting stuck in rental accommodation at a time in their life journey? And indeed, does this mean that there is a barrier in terms of their integration journey? Is there a barrier in terms of where they would like to be able to own their own home? And if so, why might this be? And how might we develop policies to respond to it? As the Minister has said, our department will soon begin the work to develop a successor to the whole of government Migrant Integration Strategy, which ran from 2017 to the end of last year. In fact, this work has already begun with the commissioning of an evaluation of the implementation of that strategy, alongside two other equality strategies that ran concurrently: the National Strategy for Women and Girls and the National Traveller and Roma Inclusion Strategy. In developing the new integration strategy, we'll have regard to today's findings, which clearly point to the fact that housing needs to take its place in our policy conversation on integration. In terms of how that will progress, we're hoping to begin consultations on the new strategy later this year. A particular consideration of future equality strategies will be how they address intersectionality and the impact of multiple forms of discrimination. And for instance, this research has looked at family composition at the intersection of migrant origin and being a lone parent. We know, for instance, in terms of this report, that it highlights the particular challenges of migrant women, for example, in accessing the labour market. And particularly among these groups, they're more likely to be single parents or to have large numbers of dependent children. And obviously, their experience then and their needs need to be part of a whole of government policy response. So a successor to the National Strategy for Women and Girls will also have to focus on the migrant experience, while the successor to the Migrant Integration Strategy will have to focus on the experiences of men, women, of people of different gender identities, different sexual orientations, but also of different family compositions. The whole area of data is absolutely crucial. We recognise how difficult it is to track the impact of intersectionality, but I'm pleased to say that we are currently working with the Central Statistics Office to develop an equality data strategy, and very much recognising the need to collect equality data that can be disaggregated, both in terms of migrant origin, but also in terms of gender, sexual identity, family composition. I'd also like to draw your attention to the review of the Equality Acts, which is now underway in the department. I've mentioned the most recent addition was the addition of an extra ground which protects against discrimination in the rental housing market. However, we know that the equality legislation first enacted in 1998 and 2000 respectively, need now to be updated to reflect the new challenges of this age, to strengthen the protections, for instance, in terms of gender identity, but also to look at whether or not protections are necessary in terms of socioeconomic status. We've been very pleased. We've had a very dynamic consultation process, and now we're looking at beginning the process of writing the actual review. The whole area for migrants of racism is important, and in this regard, we're looking forward to the completion in the near future of the work of the Independent Anti-Racism Committee to develop a new national action plan against racism for Ireland. As we're all aware, there can be a significant overlap between integration and racism, and we believe that this new action plan, when adopted by government, will provide a new impetus for tackling the new types of discrimination that make it harder for people to integrate successfully. Throughout all of our policy development work, we rely heavily on the continued production of high quality independent policy evidence. It's absolutely crucial to our work. The ESRI has been an important partner in this regard. We would particularly like to salute the work of Professor Fran McGinnity and her colleagues in producing such an important piece of policy research, and we look forward to seeing how its findings will inform our policy development for the future. Many thanks.
Great, thanks so much for that, Cara. You covered a significant range of areas there, some of which we might get a chance to come back. You'll understand as from a data perspective, references to the work with the CSO on equality data and stuff like that. And I know actually that's something that Fran has been thinking about. But anyway, we better not divert ourselves, even though I'm tempted. We might come back to it. So another old friend of the ESRI, Dáithí Downey. It's a pleasure to have you here with us, Dáithí from Dublin City Council. And again, we look forward to your remarks.
Thank you very much, and good afternoon, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here, delighted, and very welcome piece of work. Congratulations to all involved, it's very important. I have a slide deck that should start if Jim is still has his finger on the trigger. Yes, he does. I'm just going to take a few minutes to reflect back some of the work that's underway in Dublin that I know more about. There are other local authorities in the country doing some extraordinarily powerful work as well, but particularly in terms of Dublin, in terms of its local capacity and its service response, in terms of the challenge of migration, integration and housing. So if we could move on, please, Jim. So the city really is a much more diverse place. Next slide, please. Today, maybe 1 in 5 people living in the city of Dublin is born outside of Ireland and outside of the UK. We have 65 different languages that we know of, spoken daily at home in Dublin. All the world's major religions are here. At least 1 in 20 of Dublin's residents is very visibly different as a person of Asian or African descent. And Dublin has more than twice as many foreign-born residents as the rest of Ireland. And that's a significant change in the experience of the city. You can see from the map there, that's the distribution of migrant nationality in the city, and that distribution is very significant in how it's spatially attributed across the city in different types of housing and housing tenure. It maps particularly closely, as Professor McGinnity's findings have shown, to the private rented sector and its distribution in Dublin. But the diversity of Dublin, it's not just a story of temporary labour markets or labour migration, I beg your pardon. People are here to stay. 1/3 of people of Asian or African descent living in Dublin are Irish citizens. It's very important to note that. And many EU citizens have made Dublin their home too. One way of thinking about it, again, that's become very important for us to try and frame this, is to look to the future and recognizing that 1 in 7 children and young people in the city has at least one parent from a minority ethnicity. 1 in every 15 younger Dubliners is from a visible minority from Asian or African descent. And next slide, please. And the reason why this is significant to us is because it brings forward a bit more color to this very important issue of overcrowding and cost overburden in housing that has been identified in the research. We know, as it has been said, that access to adequate and affordable housing is a key determinant of successful integration and how the housing conditions that a person is experiencing has a very strong impact not only on their education, but their employment and their interaction between their own migrant community and indeed between host communities. And we know that those housing conditions, where they're poor, where they're weak, can manifest as a form of social segregation, can have a spatial aspect to it. And that's something we have to be very concerned about, avoiding the undue concentration of migrant households experiencing exclusion, living in poor housing conditions, where there is a social cohesion challenge that has to be tackled as a result. And we know that house price increases and rent increases, the shortage of affordable and social housing options, and indeed discrimination in the housing market will make it, and do continue to make it, difficult for migrants to find adequate and long-term housing solutions. And what's significant perhaps about this data that's there from SILC, the EU SILC is from 2019, is that it's referring to the risk of poverty and social exclusion, the rate of overcrowding and the housing cost overburden, which is 40% of net housing costs, as far as I understand, but how that impacts very disproportionately on migrants who are outside of the EU. So there's a very particular challenge for people who do not have the reciprocal arrangements underneath EU agreement, if you will, EU conditionality, and membership of an EU as an EU citizen to access public and social services in Ireland. And that's, if you move on please, Jim, that's one of the major reasons why the city has been persistent in trying to advance service provision and development for categories of service users, for people experiencing the multiple forms of exclusion in the city, particularly homelessness, as was identified in the study, particularly amongst people who are, as we would frame, irregularly staying or irregularly established by way of access to reciprocal arrangements underneath EU social protection. We go back to 2015 when our first piece of work on homelessness and migration was published, and from there we developed some further evidence that helped inform the Dcc Integration Strategy. So that's the next slide, please, Jim. The Dcc Integration Strategy ran from 2016 to 2020. It's in continuity as we await, and it's very, very welcome, awaiting the commencement of the new policy. There were a number of specific actions just listed there on housing per se, and perhaps the most core was the supports to migrant groups to support their access to existing accommodation services where they were provided, and to develop interventions to try and activate labour market participation and activation amongst migrants as a way of overcoming some of the barriers to accessing social protection. So if you can move on again, please. That's brought us right up to date. At present, the local Community and Development Committee continues to develop a framework plan for integration and intercultural strategy, which was adopted formally by Dublin City Council in June of last year. Our public participation network is growing. We have over 820 organisations established through that, and a dedicated thematic group, a panel group within that PPN. And that's a very important source for the continued representation and participation of migrants in the city. But the most important thing we've done since is to start work collaboratively with the United Nations International Organization of Migration. We're working with them as they are the experts in terms of global migration management and programs. They have institutional models which we're learning from in Italy and Belgium. And one of the things we're exploring is the possibility of a migrant forum for Dublin. There's a presentation from the IOM to the Dublin City Council Housing Strategic Policy Committee. That's it there on the link if you wish to go and see some more. So moving on to what we'll be doing immediately, we've just engaged with the IOM to undertake the Migrant Governance Indicators study. So that's the next slide, please. This is a first for Ireland, first for Dublin. The MGI report operates at a national level for Ireland, only recently concluded. But we're going to develop one bespoke to Dublin. That will include a big emphasis, of course, on housing as well as other indicators of integration. And we'll be hopefully bringing that forward this year. So finally then, just on the last slide, some observations about how maybe housing and integration policy should start to become a bit more interdependent and supportive. We need to continue, I suppose, very quickly to maintain the target supports where they're needed. We have to introduce better measures to combat discrimination against migrants and ethnic minorities seeking access to housing. That may be language and translation services, that may be training and awareness programs for service providers, local government and elsewhere. We have to tackle overcrowding. That's a very substantial challenge, but effective enforcement for the minimum standards of rental accommodation and the maintenance of quality in rental is very important for safety reasons, but also through the protection and articulation of tenants' rights. We have to recognise the housing costs overburden continues and will continue. And there are questions to be considered about the incorporation of the housing assistance payment and indeed rent supplement for protection applicants, as referred to earlier, and how that works again for migrants is also a very significant issue. And I should mention we should obviously continue to resource the response to homelessness, particularly through our homeless action plans, having migrant homeless action teams established targeting particular interventions for people with support needs and homelessness will be very important to us. The last thing I might mention is that there is a real opportunity now to look to the future to start developing multi-stakeholder partnerships for the provision of new housing locally. At present, the only one ethnicity in Ireland that has a housing, approved housing body information is Shana, which is the traveller housing association, and working with, but we don't have nationalities or Black or minority ethnic identities involved in approved housing body formation at the moment, and we should really start supporting that and to cost rental and social rental as well. And overall, I think we need to reconsider forms of social housing provision and overall housing provision, that we could bring forward community trusts and housing cooperatives for rental and shared equity affordable purchase would be two areas where migrant households in other jurisdictions have made very significant contributions to resolving the housing issues. So I'll stop there. Thank you very much.
Great, thanks so much, Dáithí. Again, lots of food for thought there. So may well have sort of prompted some questions in the Q&A. So I'm going to go to the questions and answers now. And obviously, Fran, you're still with us. Dáithí and Carol are very welcome to interject on any of the issues if they want. And then if any of Fran's co-authors that are here with us want to get involved in the discussion, they're very welcome to do so as well. So first question that popping up here in front of me. So apart from the congratulations to you, Fran, for an excellent presentation, the interesting question is, what measures would you be most keen to look at or update once Census 2022 results are published? So very much a forward-looking question, but given that we've just gone, I presume like when you were doing this or again with the colleagues, issues would have struck you that it would be nice to have the most up-to-date information. So do you want to reflect for a moment on what those would be?
Yes, Alan, interesting indeed. I mean, I think we really would like to update, you know, those kind of main indicators just to see, you know, is the story with private renting, has that changed? You know, because we know migration is dynamic. There was possibly slightly less migration during the COVID pandemic, but still, you know, new people are coming in and some people are leaving. So, you know, in terms of the size of these migrant groups, what their housing situation is, what their family situation is, and maybe dig a bit deeper into, you know, this whole notion of duration and, you know, what role does it play, how long you've been living in Ireland. And of course, many of them then, the ones who came at the end of the last boom, they'll have been in Ireland longer. And also intermarriage, mixed unions. I think we looked at this and found some very interesting patterns. It hasn't been a major topic in Ireland before, but I think maybe going into that in a little more detail would be exciting. It'll take a little while, of course, but it's quite exciting that it's going to come on stream.
Okay, good. Thanks for that. So next question, and actually this is a tricky one because I think it's problematic for all research on migration. Okay, and it's Kelly Birmingham asking, is there any measure possible or any analysis on the number of people repatriating to their country of origin? Okay, and again, just to develop the question, Kelly, I imagine that this might be something we need to look at for housing stock turnover, ongoing provision and repurposing of buildings where possible. Also curious about a slightly different type of question about the provision of proportionate community spaces accessible to all communities. But I suppose it's not always the challenge of migration research that if you're looking at a group of people at a point in time, you may be looking at the group of people for whom the whole migration experience has worked out reasonably well, and that's why they're still here. Where it's that group who migrate and have particularly bad experiences may either move on to a third country or may actually go home. So I think there's a generalized problem here, but would you like to comment on it? And again, Helen, our colleagues are welcome to come in here as well.
Alan, I think that's linked to this whole idea of migration being a dynamic phenomenon, you know, and who's there changing over time. And I think, you know, relating to the point of the next census as well, you know, it's not going to be actually all the same people, all the same migrants in the 2022 census. But I think what we try and do is have a whole, you know, it's the bigger picture, the broader patterns, which general groups are doing well or doing okay in the housing situation. So it's not you know, we're trying to pick up broader representative patterns. But you're right, we can't rule out that those you know, that some moved, some people for whom the experience was very negative moved back, or indeed that some people who had a very positive experience in Ireland just moved on as well, because that was you know, staying in Ireland wasn't part of their life plan.
Yep, no good. Carol, I see your hand up. Did you want to come in?
Thanks very much, Alan. Just to say the question references repatriation, and really that's, you know, just building on Fran's point, it's a very small part of the whole. There is a program with the International Organization for Migration for people who want voluntarily to return to their countries of origin. But in any one year, the number of people who participate in that program is very, very small, or indeed the number of people who fail the international protection process and are deported, that's also very, very small, whereas what's much larger is the number of people voluntarily deciding that Ireland, you know, isn't part of their life journey, or indeed having completed a life of work in Ireland, you know, returning, for instance, back to Poland or to the UK and having a life, you know, as a retiree elsewhere. That's a much bigger part of the whole.
Great, thanks. Good points, Carol. Thanks for that. So next questions, I'll just read it out. So do the report authors and our Department of Housing, well, they're not here to answer, have any observations or recommendations on the increasing reliance on HAP as a form of social housing support and the consequential risks this leaves in place for migrant households? Okay, so a very specific question on HAP as the form of housing support. Any of you want to take that? I know it's probably slightly on the edges of the what the research has done. Helen?
I suppose one of the issues with HAP is, you know, that you're sourcing housing in the private rented sector, you know. So I think part of the difficulties is that if you're maybe new to the country, that you maybe don't have that same information around accessing housing, and also that there's evidence of discrimination, you know, in private renting as well. So that you know, so for migrants on that benefit, you know, that they may be lower down the queue in terms of then the landlords selecting tenants. So that, you know, that there's sort of an added disadvantage for outsiders in the system, I suppose. But yeah, and it's also just less secure than the longer term social housing. So I think that's an issue for all of the tenants in that sector.
And this, just to add to what Helen's saying, you know, this sort of longer term move, if you like, you know, away in generation, in a 40-year perspective, away from social housing towards, you know, supplements in the private sector has been very challenging for disadvantaged groups. So the idea of, you know, increasing the provision of social housing, so disadvantaged groups, be they Irish or migrant, aren't competing in a very competitive private rental market, I think would be a clear conclusion from this report.
Great, thanks for that. I'm going to take it's another question from Aisling Murray. Now, I think you were corresponding bilaterally, Helen, with Aisling on this, but I think it's an important issue. So I might just get you to develop on the theme here. So the question really is about whether or not migrants might simply have a preference for renting. And it's the real sort of question you get when you've a bunch of economists sitting around, that what you observe is always just because that's people choose the way it is. Now, as a very sort of simplistic economic analysis is always there. But anyway, how would you respond to that question?
Yes, so I mean, it is, as you say, an important question. It's you know, the role of preferences in there. I mean, it's, as Fran said, you know, some of it we can, you know, in the census, obviously there's nothing about choice, so we try to, in a sense, compare like with like. So you try and look at people who have been here longer and have the same current, you know, same level of education, similar employment. You know, you still see those gaps, but obviously you still can't then necessarily read preferences off that. But there's a very interesting study that Owen Corrigan and colleagues in IGES did recently. They did a survey of the aspirations of people in the rental sector, and found a high level of preference for home ownership, both amongst the Irish and non-Irish respondents. So they found that aspiration was almost equally strong amongst the migrant population as well. So that's I did put the link into the reference into the chat, but it's in the it's in the back of the report as well.
It's in the report, yeah.
Brilliant. Okay, thanks for that. Another quite sort of broad question, which I'll just put you anyway. But this idea, in your opinion, how much, and let's put it in terms of the non-integration of migrants, how much will the non-integration sort of cost in terms of social externalities today or tomorrow for Irish society? Okay, so it's that incredibly broad question. I suppose there's two components to it. I mean, one is the extent to which you perceive that there is a lack of integration, okay, and just the scale of that. I think there is an interaction here then possibly with the integration of sort of second generations. But I mean, do you want to have a stab at that, Helen or Fran, or again anybody else?
Yes, Alan, I can. It is quite a broad question, but you know, just thinking about, for example, this idea of housing and private rented accommodation, migrants living there. You know, if you're thinking long term, migrants integrating into Ireland, integrating into Irish communities, you know, frequent moves of houses will really negatively affect their ability to put down roots or to settle, as people in Ireland often say, if they're continually moving. And that's also then for their children, the second generation, you know, the way if there's this sort of insecurity and frequent moves, that might you know, that'll have knock-on you know, effects on and we saw, you know, in the COVID pandemic how important communities are, and this is one, you know, in terms of integrating more broadly into society, but also integrating into particular communities and feeling like they're belonging. And it can then, of course, too, inhibit the ability to hold down a job if you have to move out of the area. So I think, you know, it has a problem, say, in the housing market, has a whole you know, domino effect for other integration outcomes.
Yeah, and Helen, before I come to you, and again, you might want to pick up on my next comment or not, but just thinking across various strands of ESRI research, another piece, and apologies if anybody in the call is involved in this, but looking at this issue of the extent to which you now have an increasing group of retirees who are renters. Okay, so it's sort of long been thought that in many ways the Irish approach to social welfare, where the sort of the payment is fixed and generally sort of, you know, I don't want to use the phrase low, but certainly the Irish, the state pension doesn't do a great job at replacing incomes above a certain level. And part of that seemed to be this idea that when you arrive at retirement, your mortgage may well be paid off. Now, it seems to me, in a very long-term sense, that one of the issues that Ireland will have to deal with in the future, which we haven't, is an older cohort of migrants. Okay, given the age at which most of our migrants have arrived, there's a long-term issue. And so, to the extent that you're sort of demonstrating that the migrants are going to be disproportionately renters, it sounds like they'll also be disproportionately represented in this group of retirees on state pensions, conceivably. With that, but not in home ownership situations. So I don't know, Helen, if that's something you've thought about or want to comment on at all.
It's not something that that we've worked on ourselves. And as you say, the age profile of migrants is particularly young, so they haven't, except the UK group. Who are much more similar in all these in the outcomes that we look at here. Our colleagues in the institute, there's a report on my desk to review which looks precisely at that. Yes, it's in the works, Alan. So you'll have to wait for that one, but it's looking precisely at that. What the implications are for
sure.
For future income. I mean, just go back to that broader question about implications. I was just going to pick up on that segregation issue that Dáithí was mentioning as well. So in general, we don't see high levels of residential segregation of migrants across the country. And I suppose maybe there, if you saw, when we looked at this literature, we looked at this past one, that it's when there's hyper segregation that you might start getting worried. I think in Ireland, because the migrant population is so diverse, you've got so many different people from so many different countries that there hasn't been that sort of residential segregation. And there can be positives as well in terms of people accessing support in their community if they're migrating to a new country, if there's somebody else, if there's others with the same nationality or linguistic background. But I think it's probably something that we want to be careful of in terms of social cohesion, that you don't have this segregation. But I don't know if Dáithí had something to.
Yeah, and actually, if I could just add to that, Dáithí, because there is a question here complimenting you on the maps that you've shown and talked about the sort of the value of geo-reference data, and I think it is important. But you're probably best qualified, or possibly anyway, to answer the sort of issues that Helen was touching on there. And it's almost like this sort of for migrants, that if they have, and this is for migrant populations throughout the world, having a group of people from the one country can be very supportive locally in the initial stages. But it seems that if that group then becomes too big, then ghettoization becomes a worry. And there has to be this. And I'd be really interested, just from your observations in Dublin, do we have enough supports? Do we have too much support? And so, or just what would be your reflections on that issue of compatriots or whatever like that across the city?
Yeah, thank you. Well, look, housing and identity are incredibly complex set of relationships as they're expressed locally. And many neighborhood areas become characteristic of certain cultural or indeed ethnic identities in all the major global cities you go to. And indeed parts of cities are marketed on the basis of certain cultural artifacts and identities. So it has to be reasonably obviously understood by most people that the diversity in a city, in any space, is expressed as a spatial component of the city. And I think that's where this current census will be at its most powerful, will be in revealing the established patterns that are consolidating amongst the migrant population who are most marginal to economy, employment, access to public services and education and in health in particular, who are least protected perhaps in the broadest possible use of that term, and who are enduring the longer periods of residence in disrupted forms of residence in multiple moves to lesser quality rental accommodation. That is a characteristic of certain parts of the city that would be known particularly to homeless and other service providers. Threshold in particular talk a lot about the challenges of understanding the dynamics of the private rented sector. But we do have the advantage in Ireland that we've learned from other places. We have as has been said, a broad distribution of migrants. We don't yet have any overtly obvious social segregation that could be, classified in that term ghetto, which is a term I'd probably not want to include in this debate for reasons of misunderstanding more than anything else. What we're trying to avoid, obviously, is any one particular locale or neighborhood becoming the designated or identifiably localized area where a concentration of high support needs amongst the migrant population can be established. And we must be very careful to reconsider participation in work, education and health services as the key component that makes housing successful for our migrant population. And I think we can do that. We have the advantage of quite a number of very engaged and active migrant identities in Dublin City Council, in its PPN, as I mentioned earlier. We have forthcoming the new migration strategy. We have forthcoming a new local economic community plan for the City of Dublin. And the work we're doing with IOM will foreshadow some potential new governance innovations for participation. But if there was one thing, I suppose, immediately that would improve the lot of recent migrants whose means are perhaps they have enough money for the first month or two before work becomes, or paid work becomes essential. We need to be able to ensure that people have good language supports, translation supports, very accurate and timely housing advice in terms of their rights. And we need to tackle overcrowding. Overcrowding is a very substantive issue in terms of both the risk, the health and the reputation that sometimes is wrongly then associated with a migrant group who may be characterized elsewhere as otherwise in some way colluding in their housing arrangements, that they agree to live like this in this overcrowded, unfit housing. And that's an experience in other cities to just be very careful to warn against.
Great, thanks for that, Dáithí. Well, as it turns out, I think we'll be giving you the last word because we've just drifted over the 3:15 mark. So before we go, I do want to thank both Carol and Dáithí for coming along and participating in the webinar today. It's really much appreciated. I also want to thank the department for their ongoing sort of support of the research and engagement with it. It's again very, very much appreciated. I want to thank the Minister, of course, for coming along today and addressing us. And I haven't done this yet, but obviously I want to do this now, which is thank the authors of the report. So Fran, I'm thanking you on multiple occasions today, but I'll do so again. Then Ivan Falco, Helen, again on the call, Sarah Kirsten, Amy Stapleton, and James Lawrence. So again, sincere thanks to all of you, and congratulations again on an excellent report. So with that, obviously, I want to thank our participants who came along today. I'm sure we'll be doing this again very, very soon, whatever the next report is. But again, always appreciate people's attendance. So with that, we'll conclude. So thank you so much.